Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Professor Linderberg, first of all, for your kind invitation and the opportunity of listening to this wonderful array of lectures today. It's been inspiring. I examined the passage of a Chinese historiographical work, the description of the capital of the Fulin Empire, as reported in the Jutangshe chapter 198. This is the first edition of the dynastic history of the Tang dynasty produced in the 10th century, but incorporating earlier material dating back to the 7th century. Fulin is traditionally understood as the Chinese rendition for Byzantine Empire, so its capital is obviously, should be at least, Constantinople. I analyzed the structural elements of this Chinese source to show how we are probably not dealing with a reliable odeporic bulletin from which we can actually derive concrete data on the Byzantium of the 7th century, but rather with a patchwork of mythologemata on a flourishing but fictive capital at the antipodes of the geopolitical galaxy of the Middle Kingdom. Consequently, this methodological approach casts a radical doubt about the term Fulin itself. If the Chinese imagery on its capital is a fabrication, what reality did the whole Fulin exactly indicate? The identification of Fulin on a geographical basis following the itinerary to reach the city of Fulin described by the Jutangshe scholars identified its phantasmal capital either as Constantinople or as Antioch of Syria or as Qom in northern modern Afghanistan or as Antioch in Marjana, now Merv. In Jutangshe chapter 198, the state of Fulin is treated in the context of the Western barbarians, Siron, at the end of a long mental itinerary that from Nepal, Nipolwo, India, Tianzhu, leads to Persia, also, and finally to Fulin and Tash. This geography of the mind can be compared with a coeval description of the reign of Fulin contained in the COG, Notes of the Journey to the West, by Xuanzang, the Chinese pilgrim who left the capital, Chang'an, in 628 and returned only in 645 after having spent 17 years in India and having traveled through the kingdoms of Central Asia between China and India. One should bear in mind that Xuanzang did not personally visit all the countries mentioned in his travel report. In an introductory note generally omitted in translation in Western languages, it clearly states, 亲简者110国，传闻者20有8. I have visited 110 countries and 28 others I wrote based on what I've heard from others. Let's therefore examine the description of Fulin. The Arabs, Ashur, rebelled against the Persian king, and not only did they gain their independence, but eventually acquired enough power to dominate Persia. They traded in the West Sea and their ships, sailing south, reached the island of Ceylon, moving once again, going from Persia northwards for 10 days through the mountains. We reach Arabia, and beyond there is Xiao Fulin War, the little Fulin. There, they worship God, but they don't know Buddhism. In their law, they do not practice kneeling. Ta Fulin War, the great Fulin, is located northwest of the sea, which borders the little Fulin. The king of Great Fulin has a strong army and is not subject to any other country. The Arabs invaded it without success. The land is large enough and full of precious things, mules, donkeys, sheep and horses, as well as mats, etc. Their dress resembles that of Persians and Arabs, but their language is not the same. The term Fulin enters Chinese historiographical literature in the 7th century. In Sui Shu, it indicated Anatolia. In my opinion, in the passages from the COG, the Great Fulin indicates the Anatolian Byzantine Empire, whereas the Little Fulin refers to Syria. For some reasons, the Chinese source in question not only perceived Syria as a territory independent of Byzantium, which incidentally is per se problematic datum, but also as a territory still independent of Arab expansionism. Therefore, this 10th century source would incorporate a description of the geopolitical situation between 628, date of the departure of the pilgrimages of Xuanzang, therefore plausibly a few years later, and 634, the year of the battle of the Yarmouk and of the consequent Arab conquest of Syria. It must be acknowledged immediately that the discipline that tries to analyze the mechanisms of the Chinese transliteration of foreign toponyms, identifying which area they refer to, is rough terrain. Speculation on Fulin's etymology has produced a plethora of hypotheses since the end of the 19th century, the most prominent until halfway through the last century, where the Jacquet, Yule, Potier, Chavin theory, according to which Fulin would derive from Pauline, Earth's theory, which suggested relation from Bethlehem, the Syrian missionaries would have gladly made the name of their homeland coincide with the birthplace of Christ, just like Maghada, the birthplace of the Buddha. In Chinese, Mojatuo stood by Sino-Indo-Hellenica for the whole of India in various tongue sources. Shiratori's theory, which sees its origin in a corruption of Rome through Altaic mediators. The term Fulin occurs for events of the same period, also in the Jutangshu, including the mention of the famous first embassy of the kingdom of Fulin in China in the 19th year of the dynastic era, Zhengguan, it's 645 CE. King Botuoli of the kingdom of Fulin sent an embassy which brought as gifts cinnabar-colored glass, lapis lazuli, and more. Emperor Taizong issued a certificate and sent it that it was made large and gave in return thirst for ling and qi. The testimony raises some doubts. What name is hidden behind this Wang King Potuoli, pronounced Potuoli in today's Putonghua, but Puatalik in Middle Chinese? The coeval Byzantine Emperor Constantine II, Pogonatos, who at the time would have been 13 years old, it is phonetically unlikely. The problem is not only phonetic, but also historical. None of these embassies were recorded by Western sources. Perhaps one might suppose that they were not formal legations from the court, but initiatives of peripheral toparchoi. A patricios, perhaps regent for the Pogonatos, or can we glimpse a politis behind this transliteration by textual corruption via syllabic metathesis? As far back as 1885, Earth already saw in Puatalik a transcription of the Arabic and Persian word batrik, patriarch, and speculated that the king of Fulin behind the episode of 643 was actually the head of the Nestorian church in Ctesiphon. However, these missionaries used Syriac or Pahlavi as a bureaucratic language, not Arabic or Persian. My hypothesis is that one Putuali could be the attempt, in fact, quite a precise one, to translate the first constituent and transliterate the second constituent of the title Protopatricios, first patrician, a position in force from 367 to 711. So the term would be secular and political. That's why Greek was used and not religious. However, here rises my actual perplexity. By 645, Syria had been subjugated by the Arabs. If this embassy came from an independent kingdom, whom would it be representing? One could assume that it was a delegation of missionaries from the Eastern Syriac Church who pretended to be a political delegation, from an independent kingdom, knowingly passing off their religious situation in an autocephalous church as their political situation, in order to have a freer hand in carrying out proselytism. In Syriac, the title of patriarch sounds resh malteba, patriarcha, which does not find a precise correspondence in putuali, unless we surmise an apocope of the last syllable, putuali, ke. Saeki, in his essay dating back to 1937, The Nestorian Documents and Relics in China, correlates the transcription of the stele of Xi'an of 781 of the Jutanshu, which, as mentioned above, in its definitive guise dates back to the 10th century, but which probably incorporates material already from the 7th century, of post-14th century Nestorian obituary diptychs, and proposing the following deduction. If in 781, the transliteration of a priest's name as Fulin still points to an Ephraim, in 645, Fulin War can only mean the kingdom from which one or more priests called Ephraim come. It is difficult to agree with Saeki's deduction for several reasons. First of all, in Chinese, the expression priest Fulin in the 781 C inscription could also mean brachylogically a priest from the land of Fulin, and not the priest Ephraim. Secondly, the expression van in the event of 645 could be a brachylogy for fa wang, the Syriac mafrian, fruitful, the Syriac term for Catholicos. I propose a different interpretation of this whole swarm of data and an hypothesis. As for the case of putuali, one should take into consideration the diachronic pronunciation of Chinese, for which the studies of Cargren and Paul Leblanc can be used. So I will skip the charts and I will go straight to the flesh. Until the 8th century, the syllable Fulin would be pronounced more or less Fitlian. A fourth hypothesis, also reaffirmed by Schreiner, suggests that Fulin would derive from an Iranian form, Frum, Frim. Iranian, we can narrow this indication. In fact, surprisingly enough, we have no attestation of the Old Persian term for Rome. Middle Persian has Khrum. Among Iranian languages, Frum is the normal Sogdian and Bactrian voice for Rome. Having to transliterate Frum, an 8th century Chinese speaker would have faced two problems. Firstly, the Chinese had no longer consonantal clusters as a syllable onset. Therefore, they would have had to dissolve the cluster fr in a sequence f vowel lr with a preference of u as an epenthetic vowel, then fur. But at this point, a second problem would have emerged, that is how to render the liquid r absent in the Chinese phonetic palette. A possible solution would have been exactly with the cluster t plus l, tl, which then would probably have undergone simplification, futlin, fulin. Our outcome futlim or futlim actually seems suitable to transliterate Ephraim too, and obituary diptychs support this. But futlim is an excellent candidate to transliterate Bactria as well, and therefore the description of the capital could be ascribed to Antioch in Marjana, modern-day Merv. But in that case, what would that great Fulin, a phantom Bactramayer, which the Arabs could not conquer, correspond to? I would like to focus on two syndromes that are triggered when two linguistic cultures come into contact. Nothing new under the sun, but they are two tools that I found useful in my recent research about the narrative prototypes of the Byzantine novel Varlam ke Yoasaf, and which I believe may be of use in addressing this issue too. I would call these syndromes the Mondegreen effect and the Smerdes effect. The Mondegreen effect, the term was coined by the American writer Sylvia Wright, who as a child often listened to her mother reading a 17th century ballad from the collection Relics of Ancient English Poetry by the poet Thomas Percy. The highlands and the lowlands, where have you been? They slain the earl of Moray and led him on the green. Little Sylvia consistently understood the last verse and Lady Mondegreen, and in doing so, her mistake and her imagination had given concrete shape to a partner for the Count of Moray. In other words, each listener is ready to understand and misunderstand the message based on her own bag of expectation, her Weltanschauung. And this generates what is called an acoustic pareidolia. Such misinterpretations are not aberrations, though. They're the event horizon in interlinguistic communication. Let's examine now what I call the Smerdes syndrome, or the Smerdes effect. Bardia was the younger son of Cyrus the Great. His name derives from the Proto-Iranic bards, to be tall. In the Elamite version of the description of Bisotun, he's called Pirtia, but the Akkadian version and the private documents of Babylon have the medium for Barzia. It is called Smerdis in Herodotus, Mardos in Aeschylus, Mergis in Justin, Marphios in Hellanicus. It is evident that the Iranian initial consonant B was never perceived B by the Greek historians, who instead rendered it either sm or m. For what reason? Might it have been that the original form of the name included a more complex initial consonant cluster, zb, zm, zmb, which was simplified in Greek? Perhaps. Perhaps in order to understand the deformation of the original name from Persian into Greek, one must take into account the role played by intermediary cultures between the Persian and the Greek court. I call such deformation of a name through Chinese whispers, from which the title of my intervention, of a sequel of adjacent cultures, the Smerdes effect. Bringing these syndromes back to our case, we have seen several plausible candidates for the foreign intermediary of the Chinese footlimb: Middle Persian Hrum, Parthian From, Sogdian Brum, Altaic Vrum, but these variants certainly should not be imagined in a mechanical chain. They came to the Chinese ears through different itineraries with diachronic tides, but in a synchronic mechanism. In the final deformation, due to the concurrence of the mediation of several adjacent cultures, it is necessary to recognize the Smerdes effect in action. Among the various agents suggested, I believe the major role of mediation, especially of Christianity, must be assigned to Sogdian. In the use of footlimb to indicate both Syria and the missionaries called Ephraim, the Mondegreen effect comes into play. The existence of a transliteration for Rome in Fulin must have facilitated the transliteration of Ephraim in Fulin too. Indeed, it would certainly have been an advantage for a missionary if his name sounded like his geographic origin, especially if the place name was a term which had already been assimilated in previous centuries with positive connotation by his target audience. My supposition is that we are faced with a horde of paretymologies that come together generation after generation in different ways, in which the former influences the next, that is preventing a better transliteration. To sum up, Middle Chinese Putlian probably renders from, attested in Sogdian, in Parthian, in Bactrian Fromo, and in turn derived from the initial aspirated forms of Armenian Chrom, Chrum, and Middle Persian Chrom. However, one should still reflect on the non-correspondence Between the vocalism y of the second syllable of the Middle Chinese term futlium and the vocalism o of the Iranian term, one should assume either that the Iranian back vowel of the term has not colored the epenthetic vowel of the first Chinese syllable, or that the Chinese term is the only other extant witness of the nation alternation Khrum, Khrim in Pahlavi. The other witness is identified by Modi 1905. He noted that Pahlavi Sairima in Farvardin Yasht equals to Rum in Bundaj and Shahnameh. As this alternation was not preserved in other Iranian languages, in this case, the intermediary of the toponym for Rome in China must have been Pahlavi speaking Persian traders, most probably before the Arabic conquest or coming from Zoroastrian enclave such as Nukhara and Yazd. I would like to bring in a key hypothesis by Antonello Palumbo. In the sources relating to the Tang period, it would be necessary to distinguish between the geographical and ethnographic Rome, Fulin, which effectively corresponds to the Byzantine Near East, and the politics that had relations with the Tang between the 7th and 8th centuries, which instead, in Palumbo's opinion, corresponds to a Turkish Christian principality in Central Asia, in the area of Balkh, in Tokharistan, with its center in the city of Kolm. In my opinion, therefore, in the Tang era, behind the term Fulin, there would hide a fusion of different realities thanks to acoustic pareidolia, that is the Mondegreen effect. A little Fulin indicating Syria, and sooner, later, the Syriac and Middle Persia-speaking missionaries of the Eastern Syriac Church, a great Fulin indicating the Anatolian part of the Byzantine Empire. I'm not convinced that the city of Byzantium falls within this imaginary. A Central Asian Fulin, more precisely in Tokharistan. In fact, the geography of Eran Shah, drawn up by the Armenian pseudo Moses Horenachi in the first half of the 8th century, mentions a province of Khrum in Tokharistan. Byzantium enjoyed a certain diplomatic prestige in Central Asia, as attested by the case of an 8th century Turk Shahi leader in Afghanistan who called himself Fromo Caesaro, or Caesar of Rome. Further evidence of a Central Asian location of the Kingdom of Fulin comes of the Chinese historical sources themselves. In the 7th year of the Kaiyuan era, that is 719, in the same year in which the Yabgu of the Tokharistan recommended a high Manichaean prelate to Xuanzong, the Kingdom of Fulin sent 2 missions to the Chinese court. This information can be interpreted in different ways. Either the Chinese indicated the Central Asian principality near Kolm using the name of Fulin, or the leaders of the Eastern Syriac Church pretended to be political ambassadors of a state, the Syrian part of the Byzantine Empire, which not only had never been independent, but that in the 8th century had been absorbed into the Islamic Caliphate. Or again, these Syrian or Persian ecclesiastical leaders, due to their cultural preparation and their multilingualism, were often co-opted by the political magnates as delegation chiefs. Fulin War could therefore be interpreted in a broad sense, not as an indication of a political belonging, but rather of an ethnic one. The head of the delegation is of Syriac origin, we would say, but this connotation in the cosmopolitanism of the 8th century China should not be mistaken for the bureaucratic origin of the delegation, which could have been from a completely different court. A further key indication for the Central Asian origin of the 645 embassy are the gifts which were brought. The largest center in Asia for the extraction of lapis lazuli, Jingding, was located in the mountains of Badakhshan, near the city of Okuran, an area of Hindu Kush already subjected to the Yabgu of Tokharistan. The case of the embassy of the false, and we have to mention that along the Silk Road, we have sources about a lot of false embassies. For example, the false embassies by Theodulus, attested in William of Rubruck in the 13th century. So we have to dismiss many sources as false embassies, actually. A conclusive remark. None of the previous hypotheses means to exclude the other ones. We are faced with a range of attempts at transliterations, paretymologies, diplomatic ruses that by inertia deposited one on the other diachronically and sometimes concurred synchronously. Unfortunately, whatever the most plausible hypothesis, catching a glimmer of 7th century Byzantium, thanks to the testimony of Jutanshu, chapter 198, constitutes a rather impalpable possibility. Thank you for your attention.
Impalpable.
Yeah, thank you very much for this intricate theory and very well delivered presentation as well. I can't see the people there. Are there any questions now? Oh, now there's I can see. Yes. Ronald, would you like to begin?
Hi, thank you for your wonderful presentations. I just noticed a part which might be confusing to the readers. So would you mind to go back to the slides about the Shenzang, the part, and you mentioned the 西游记, the journey to the west.
Yes.
So, yeah. And I mean, from your PowerPoint, I understand as the part that looks like the 西游记 is written by Shenzang, something like this.
No.
Yeah, I know, but I mean the PowerPoint is quite a little bit confusing to me.
No. I'm sorry if I delivered this impression.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean,
in fact, the book of the 大唐西域记, the journey
Yeah,
to the
yeah,
west, its author's notes, Xuanzang is one of his follower. It's not himself in person. In fact, it is not the author.
Yeah. Of course, we have to distinguish between the implicit narrator and the actual author. And I guess that even we have a historical source stating what the real author is. Yeah, that's the final version in 16th century. I mean.
yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. And Zhao, you go ahead.
Yes. I have maybe not a question, but more probably an addition. For what you say that in the last page, you say that in the time of Xuanzong, the 70th year of Kaiyuan, maybe the Fu Ling went to China, but choose to the sea road once. But actually, I searched the Chinese documents of the Song Dynasty named the Cefu Yuangui. And it say that the country of Fu Ling went to China in Tang Dynasty 3 times. The first time is in the beginning of the Tang Dynasty.
Yeah,
the Taizong era.
I examined the 3 sources in another contribution. I can send you if you want. And in any case, the major problem with those mentioned is that they don't match any reference in Western.
Yeah, that's always been the problem with search the Chinese sources and Western sources. The comparison will be useful because that somehow we usually cannot find the comparative part from the both side. Many of them are leaked in the Eastern side or leaked in the Western side. It happened just always like. So yeah, I'm happy to know that you already noticed that, and that will be my
yeah. I focused
part,
only
yeah.
on one. I'm sorry, I focused only on one because it involved the Central Asian hypothesis, the one anchoring fully into Tokharistan. Actually, I think that we should evoke a concept that we might call the feedback time for ancient and medieval embassies, okay? Let's suppose I'm a trader, I'm a merchant along the Silk Road, and I start from Palmyra. And when I'm in Tokharistan, I buy lapis lazuli because I know that it's a prestigious gift in China. And when I arrive to China, I introduce myself as an ambassador of the Fulian kingdom with fake documents. Who can double check on me? I mean, because in the 8th century, to double check on me, the Tang emperor should have blocked me for 6 months. No, 1 year, 6 months to go and check, 6 months to come back. And every trader played on the feedback time. First remark. Second remark, not only every trader, but every what we call historiographer, and they are not historiographers, they just write crap stuff because they know that no reader will have the time to check and have a feedback. Third remark, I'm sorry, I have to stress it. We are, as philologists or historians, we are obliged to dip desperately into these sources to look for intercultural exchanges, okay? But the majority of these sources were committed by entities that had zero interest in intercultural exchange. They thrived exactly on the ignorance of the geopolitical situation of the contendent. China didn't want people to know that there was another, at least as much as powerful kingdom at the other side of the known world. Parthians didn't want the two entities to know each other better because Parthians thrived on the lack of communication, on the exchange of money, from golden to silver, okay? The only moment in the history of humanity where we start to have decent data and sources of different civilization is when citas of traders emerge and they write for themselves and not for an emperor or a politician. And these traders are Arabs. It's the Arabic literatures that provide us with the first decent travelogues in literature. Before it's, in my opinion, it's falsification. And it had to be falsification. It had to be because nobody would have shared data in a clear way. There was a monopoly of trading, so nobody would have written real stuff about the Silk Road for the 9th century. Okay.
But all of the many of them I truly agree, but there's one thing I could add is about the China's attitude for the West. I think for the Chinese government, especially in the Han Dynasty, from the Han Dynasty, it does not care about the far West exists equivalent power as the Han Dynasty is, since they described the Daqin, probably the eastern part of the Roman Empire, their cultural and their the forces, power, strength is very similar to the Han Dynasty, and this is written down by the Han document. I think the reason why the Han Dynasty does not afraid of the far West exists as such power is because that it doesn't matter. The Han Dynasty does not care about too much of the outside world, what happened in the outside world, unless that power threatened the frontiers of the China, such as the Xiongnu and some nomads in the Western regions. But that will be very few of them can threaten constantly the Chinese border. And for the far West, the Chinese know they know that it's very hard to reach them. And if we look about the economic trade history of the whole history, we can see that the Chinese merchants does not dwelling themselves to go outside the far West to do trade. The Chinese are more at least aggressive than the Western merchants in the whole ancient histories. And the other parts I truly agree, especially when we find the example of the Daqin merchant named Qin Lun went to China in the Three Kingdom period and to the Wu kingdom. That's still totally a false example, but it can, on the other hand, present authentic part that there are merchants who can reach the China from the West, from the other part of the world. Maybe they are Romans or that Romanized people from the Middle East. They can reach China. They are not ambassadors or envoys indeed, but they are merchants. As you said, they want to monopolize the trade, so they want to share the information to the others.
I totally agree. I totally agree. I simply think that we should distinguish between the reachability and the reliability. Yeah. So I'm not certain that traders could factually reach China. On the contrary, of course they did. And it was a stream of traders, loops of traders from different cultures organizing caravans. Because, for example, very small digression, no source or very scant sources talk about the logistics of those journeys. How do you travel for hundreds of miles along the Silk Road with a convoy with cash on you? The late antique world and the medieval world and even the present day world are extremely violent worlds. You couldn't go for miles on end without being robbed. And the uniqueness, for example, of Marco Polo's journey is that he didn't get killed. I mean, that he completed the whole journey himself instead of splitting the journey into smaller fragments and doing loops, which was exactly what earlier civilizations did for safety. And this reach of the loop of safety is the reach of the loop of information as well. And this effect I was referring to, the Chinese whispers. Okay, so that's why I distinguish between reachability and reliability. In order to have reliability, we have to find ourselves in front of traders, intellectuals, traders willing to write for colleagues because they want to share information and they feel that travelogues are a genre. It happens only with Arabic culture. Most Greek sources are crap. And the question I asked you this afternoon about Pausanias, in my opinion, is far better than Cosmas Indicopleustes. I actually don't know, and I'm very interested in understanding why on earth Cosmas wrote that stuff, which is totally baseless. It's just like fiction. It's fiction. So we should study the intellectual movements, first of all. Why did they forge a plausible world for readers? That's the real question. But this is not a travelogue. Have I hit the point? Did I get the message home?
Yeah. But in fact, I totally understand that. The suspicions of in Cosmas Indicopleustes is not my main problem, because it happened that the Chinese source has the corresponding information of the Cosmas Indicopleustes, and this correspondence made that clear, and that can prove even others' information may be wrong, just as full as Pliny, but we can find some true clue from the fragments, right? That's all we historians or philologists need to do. We need to organize the history and to share with the truth, right?
You're totally right. I totally agree. Well, I couldn't agree more. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Marco had a question as well.
Yes, Sergio. I have a question on crap.
I was a little graphic. I'm sorry. I did that.
No, it's okay. No. I enjoyed that because it helps bring out the question. And sometimes that's what crap is for. It moves us to respond. So your work is I think praiseworthy, philologically, and it opens up questions. And you refer to the Arabic advance, as it were, with respect to reports that are unreliable. Yes?
No, Arabic travelers are reliable. Most of the previous material is not. Yes.
Exactly what I said. Yes. Good. So with respect to previous material, that was unreliable.
There was a glitch in the voice. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And I also think of consider the whole tradition of the Aladdin and the night, the 1001. Yeah, I mean, there's this whole literary tradition that is defending a sphere of freedom that is independent of religious law. So this may have something to do with the advances that you have referred to. But now I'm wondering, we're philologists, we're historians, and obviously that means that we pursue an end. Sometimes we pursue, we could say, and maybe we can agree that we pursue a scientific end, which is based on facts, reliable facts, as opposed to fictions or crap. And sometimes I wonder, to what extent we underestimate, we undervalue, underplay the importance of other ends that in previous times writers might have held as of paramount importance. What I mean by this is something that I think, well, Sergio, you're writing from Milano, so that I think that a somewhat compatriot once would emphasize. I'm referring to a person who has been called the greatest philologist of Italy. He was from Naples, though, Giambattista Vico. And Giambattista Vico is, of course, I say to you, stressing the distinction between, and I will paraphrase him, between two modes of conducting philological studies. One is a scientific / modern, for him it's the beginning. The other one is a poetic, we could say. Now the poetic is not, shall we say, interested in exact facts, because it's pursuing a poetic / political conservative end. So for example, I could have a report that is scientifically crap. At the same time, it is poetically, politically important, valuable, because it is doing something that from a scientific point of view is meaningless, but from a classical ancient point of view is very meaningful indeed. And so it may, as Zhao mentioned, you know, there is, okay, well, China, ancient China was just not interested in those faraway people. They did not constitute a threat. It was more focusing on domestic politics, on the order of the Tianxia and so forth. So it was not really interested in expanding. And so in the modern world, this develops into colonial aggressive attitudes and movements, of course. So, you know, and of course, the scientific pursuit of a universal order, which involves getting everybody inside. So that's what I'm wondering. If we sometimes in the pursuit, legitimate or not, is not my point. In the pursuit of scientific ends, if we are underestimating the importance of poetic ends, we're discarding them, and you know, are we missing out on something? Does that perhaps also distort the image that we have, our capacity to hear the whispers of antiquity?
I thank you for your remark. You're right. You're right. Let me rephrase my position. Just like a prism, so to speak, the position we observe a phenomenon. If we are trying, my suggestion is that we should stop trying to milk some sources as truthful ones, but I think that studying the reason of the distortion is fascinating. So we should simply change the reason why we handle those sources, not to extract truth, but to study the reason of the distortion. Let me give you an example of what I mean by distortion. But the Byzantine Empire has always been trying to invade or conquer or control Armenia. You will never find in any Byzantine history the reason why they did that. And the reason is metal ores, gold mines. They desperately needed gold because the Byzantine Empire was based on gold coinage and the distribution of new gold coinage, basically what we would call huge inflation through aristocracy. So you'll never find a Byzantine source about the locations of gold mines in the empire. But if you study a map of gold mines in Europe and Asia, you will magically see the trends of expansion of the Byzantine Empire for centuries. So what should we expect from historiographers that could not analyze the real reasons of a war, of an expansion, or data that we defined as basic, like geological data, like mines and stuff, resources? The reason why we have a lot of sources about silk material, because they are the objects of trade, right? They are the stuff that traders manipulate. They can move goods, but goods are not the only expression of a culture. Why isn't any intellectual describing us culture in the late antique world or medieval? Marco Polo, for example, but he's not the first one. These kind of intellectuals did. I mean, they tried to describe customs, spirits, habits, real habits, not fake ones. Greeks were so blind that they managed to ignore for centuries that Persian is an Indo-European language. They called Persians barbaroi because they didn't understand what they said. And brother is frater in Greek and brother in Persian. Only a manipulative intellectual would have stated for centuries that Persians are barbaroi. So there is falsification at the basis of our sources. That's the normal event horizon. That's example I wanted to share.
Yeah, it's just that you see my little qualm, and I'll just throw this in as a little parenthesis with that, is that of course, this is to take for granted that there is such a thing as the emergence of scientific truth, and poetry is about fantasy, and it's not about the truth. I mean, this is a habit that modern academic discourse has. I mean, the science, the modern, and it seems to me that the ancients would not agree. That the ancients would say, well, truth, poetry, and I will paraphrase Aristotle, our friend Aristotle, poetry is closer to the truth than the historian. Yeah, is.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point.
So there I think we still have difficulties, hermeneutical difficulties in dealing with the classical sources. Okay, I mean, this raises, of course, a big can of metaphysical worms. A big can of metaphysical worms.
You must remember as well that the reason why Aristotle thought poetry lies closer to, or is better than history, is that poetry lies closer to philosophy. So it's he didn't think that poetry reached the truth either, because it wasn't philosophy, right?
And that you're opening up another can of problems, the relationship between philosophy and poetry.
But they had the common ground that they dealt with the whole. That was his idea, that takat holo. So they both strive to understand the whole, whereas history was concentrated on isolated events. That was his major problem. Aristotle's major problem with history was that it only dealt with isolated events, didn't at all care about the whole picture. At least in the poetry, he says this.
Big questions, big questions.
Big questions, true.
These are formulations which the ancients could call poetic formulations. The point of the great distinction, I think, is between the scientific way of speaking and the poetic way of speaking. In the scientific way of speaking, we seek the final formulation of problems. In the poetic way of speaking, we have various ways of mirroring the truth. And there are obviously moral ways, because there is no account that is moral or value free. Whereas in the scientific way of speaking, we posture that way. We speak as if our pronouncement were value free and therefore universal. See the big distinction. So I would emphasize this dilemma that we are faced with, this even divide between modern scientific way of speaking and a classical poetic way of speaking that does not is not predicated on the divide between facts and values.
Well, I would agree with that for sure.
Mm.
Are there still some more questions relating to Sergio's presentation? I had one small detail just about the Smerdis effect, because you mentioned several different names for Smerdis in classical Greek literature, but there is also the one of, I put it there in the chat, of Ctesias, who had, I think, Taniox Oxarche or Arches for Smerdis, and then his real name was Svendodates. I wanted to check the actual citation, but I noticed that my library didn't have access to the Jacobi online, so I couldn't check it. But there is that one as well, just a small edition. Okay. Yeah. If there are no more questions, maybe we should call it a day and continue tomorrow. What do you think? Thank you very much again, Sergio. It was a really great presentation. And thank you to everyone for joining today.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for the wonderful
Right.
and inspiring day. Ciao. See you tomorrow.
See you.
Take care.
See you tomorrow.
Ciao, ciao. Take care.
Take care.